Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a topic that's, well, it's talked about a lot, but often without the kind of nuanced understanding it really needs.
That's right.
We're talking about cannabis, yes, but we're really aiming to move past the usual recreational stories, the headlines, and really explore its specific medical uses, the documented risks, and also all those complex legal and commercial challenges that keep swirling around it.
Exactly. And the material we're drawing from today gives a really, I think, fascinating and quite rigorous look into this whole area. It does a great job, actually, of drawing a clear line based on the scientific evidence between what we really know, what's established,
Right.
and where the big complexities and, frankly, the unanswered questions still lie. It's about separating fact from, well, speculation.
And that's really our mission today. For you listening, we want to unpack the science, the policy, the sort of practical realities, give you a clear evidence-based picture of this really evolving landscape. We'll look at what the research tells us about how certain cannabinoids are actually being used therapeutically right now, what their potential effects are, good and bad for patients, and, those significant challenges they face on the path to maybe wider acceptance and integration into medicine.
And we'll be focusing right in on the specific insights from the documents we have, making sure we distinguish what's medically established from where things get, well, complicated and create those real-world hurdles.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The sheer variety, and I think crucially, the potency of cannabis products themselves. It's really not just cannabis as one single thing, is it?
No, not at all. That's a really fundamental point, and it's key to understanding everything else we'll discuss. Our sources highlight a huge spectrum, often much wider than people generally think. For instance, what's typically called marijuana, dried flowers, and leaves the reported THC concentration. That's the main psychoactive compound.
Right, the one most people know about.
Exactly. That can range from about, say, 0.5%, 0.5%, up to maybe 5.0%.
Wow. Okay, so even there, that's a tenfold difference, just in what people might casually call weed.
A huge jump.
Yeah.
And then, you get into specific cultivation methods or processing techniques, and the concentrations just climb.
Right, like sinsemilla.
Precisely. Sinsemilla cannabis, which is grown without seeds, you see a big increase there. It often falls between 7.0% and maybe 14.0% THC. Basically, the plant puts more energy into making cannabinoids when it's not making seeds.
Makes sense.
Then you have concentrates. Hashish, or hash, that's the dried resin, typically runs between 2.0% and 8.0% THC. But the real powerhouse, in terms of potency, is hash oil.
Ah, yeah.
That's an extract from hash or marijuana, and it's easily the most potent form. We're talking THC concentrations hitting 15.0%, sometimes even up to 20.0%.
15 to 20%. So hang on. If the lowest marijuana is 0.5% and the highest hash oil is 20%, that's potentially a 40-fold difference.
That's the potential range we're looking at, yeah. 40 times different. It's a staggering range.
So what does that mean? What are the implications of these, wild variations for everyone involved? The user trying to manage symptoms, the researchers doing studies, the policymakers trying to set rules?
Oh, the implications are massive.
Yeah.
Profound, really, maybe even problematic, because this variability just injects so much uncertainty into everything. For users, especially medical users trying to get consistent relief, it makes dosing incredibly difficult. Almost impossible sometimes.
Yeah, I can see that. Like taking a painkiller where one pill could be tiny and the next one huge.
Exactly. Imagine trying to take a precise amount of any medication if each dose could have anywhere from, say, 1 unit to 40 units of the active ingredient. It makes it exceptionally hard to predict the effects, manage symptoms day to day, or even just ensure safety. This inconsistency can really undermine trust.
Yep.
A patient might have a good experience one day, then a really overwhelming, maybe negative one the next, just because the product was unknowingly much stronger. And for researchers, it just complicates studies enormously. You're not always comparing if the main compound's concentration varies so wildly.
Right, it muddies the waters for results.
Totally. It makes it incredibly hard to draw clear, generalizable conclusions about health impacts or specific dose response curves or, long-term effects. It's like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces don't even fit.
And for policymakers.
A regulatory nightmare. How do you set legal limits or age restrictions or even just public health warnings for products with such vastly different pharmacological profiles? And what's really interesting, our sources even mention evidence suggesting cannabis in the Netherlands might have much higher THC levels than people thought.
Oh, really? So it's dynamic, too.
Very dynamic. It just underscores how quickly potency can change and how unregulated it can be in different places.
So the call on the source material for, more accurate data on THC content and more research into the health effects of these rising potencies,
Yeah,
it's not just a nice to have, it sounds like an urgent need.
absolutely critical. Yeah.
I mean, if we don't know exactly what's in something, how can we possibly figure out consistent dosing or predict effects, especially when we're talking about using it as medicine?
It's fundamental.
Yeah.
Without that baseline data, without a clear picture of the chemical makeup and its variability, it's like navigating blind or, trying to do surgery with only approximate measurements. Understanding the precise chemistry is just paramount for safety and efficacy in any therapeutic setting.
Mm-hmm.
And this trend of increasing concentrations just makes that need for rigorous, ongoing research into long-term effects even more pressing.
Right. But it's not just about what's in it, is it? It's also really about how it gets into your system. The delivery method seems huge.
That's a perfect segue, yes,
Hmm.
because how these different cannabis products are actually consumed drastically changes their effects. It's not just potency. The delivery system and how quickly those compounds hit the brain and body is absolutely key.
Okay, so let's break that down. What are the common ways people consume it?
Well, traditionally, and still probably most commonly, marijuana is smoked.
Right.
That could be in a hand-rolled cigarette, joint, or using a water pipe, commonly called a bong.
Okay.
Hash, the resin, is often crumbled up and mixed with tobacco, then smoked like a joint, or just smoked in a pipe, usually also with tobacco.
Right, and hash oil, that sounds a bit different.
It is. Hash oil can be like dabbed onto a regular cigarette or joint to smoke it that way, or it can be heated up so the vapors can be inhaled. That's often called vaping,
Uh-huh.
or sometimes dabbing, depending on the setup.
And there's a specific way people often smoke it to maximize the effect, right? It's not just like taking a drag on a cigarette.
No, typically not. Smokers usually engage in what's called deep inhalation. They draw the smoke way down deep into their lungs,
Mhm.
and then they hold their breath for a bit, maybe several seconds.
Why do they do that?
Well, the whole point is to maximize the absorption of THC and other cannabinoids into the bloodstream. The lungs have this huge surface area, the alveoli.
Right.
So holding the smoke gives more time for those compounds to pass into the capillaries and get to the brain really quickly. It intensifies the effects and makes them come on faster.
Okay, so speed is a big factor there. What's the main reason someone, maybe particularly someone seeking therapeutic relief, might choose smoking, despite, the obvious worries about inhaling smoke? What's the key advantage the sources point out?
The primary advantage, according to the sources, for smoking cannabis is the rapid onset and consistent cannabinoid effects. When you inhale it, the compounds basically bypass your digestive system and your liver metabolism, at least initially. They go straight into the bloodstream through the lungs.
Almost instantly.
Almost instantly, yeah. Users can feel the effects within minutes, maybe even seconds sometimes. And this really fast feedback loop is incredibly attractive for people needing quick symptom relief, like, say, sudden nausea hitting or managing sharp pain flare-ups.
Oh, I see. So you can kind of adjust on the fly.
Exactly. It allows for a degree of self-titration in real time. A user can take a small puff, wait a moment, gauge the effects. Is my nausea better? Is the pain easing? And then decide if they need a bit more. It gives a perceived sense of control over the symptoms.
But smoking isn't the only way, is it? We hear a lot about edibles now, brownies, gummies. How does eating cannabis differ from smoking it? Especially, how quickly it works and what it feels like.
You're absolutely right. Edibles are another major route. Hash and marijuana can be cooked into foods, like brownies or cookies, and then eaten. The key difference here, compared to smoking, is a completely different pharmacokinetic profile. Basically, how the drug moves through the body.
Okay.
When you eat it, the THC has to go through your digestive system, and then it gets processed by the liver, that's called first-pass metabolism, before it really enters the bloodstream in significant amounts.
So it takes longer.
Much longer. This whole process seriously delays the onset of effects, often an hour, sometimes 2 or even 3 hours before you feel anything substantial.
Wow, that's a big difference from minutes.
Huge difference. And what's more, that liver metabolism can actually convert THC into a more potent psychoactive metabolite called 11-hydroxy-THC.
More potent. So the effects could be stronger when eaten.
They can be, yeah. Not only can the effects last much longer, sometimes 6-8 hours or even more, but they can also feel more intense. And crucially, they're much less predictable compared to smoking.
Less predictable how?
Well, things like your individual metabolism, how much fat was in the food you ate it with, even how recently you ate anything else. All these things can influence how quickly and how much THC gets absorbed. It makes consistent dosing and predictable outcomes a real challenge with oral ingestion.
Okay, so smoking gives you that fast hit, that direct control, but comes with smoke inhalation risks. Eating it avoids the smoke, but it's slow, potentially more intense, and way less predictable.
That sums it up pretty well. The method of consumption clearly dictates the user's experience in a big way.
Yeah, and understanding these delivery methods really sets us up nicely to talk about how cannabinoids are actually used therapeutically and the specific challenges that come with different ways of taking them. So let's pivot now from the product itself to its actual uses and effects, both the good, the therapeutic ones, and obviously the not so good side effects.
Excellent point. That distinction is absolutely fundamental.
So with that laid out, let's move into section 2, where we really dig into the documented therapeutic niche for cannabinoids. One of the main uses mentioned in our sources is as an appetite stimulant, right? Especially for certain patients.
Yeah, that's one of the most well-established therapeutic applications discussed.
How does that work, basically? Why does it make people hungry?
Well, at a fundamental level, the sources explain that compounds called CB1 agonists, and THC is a prime example, stimulate appetite.
Hmm.
To put it simply, our bodies have this natural system called the endocannabinoid system, with receptors all over. CB1 receptors are really common in brain areas that regulate hunger, metabolism, reward.
Okay.
So when THC, acting as a CB1 agonist, binds to these receptors, it essentially flips switches that tell the brain, hey, time to eat, or this food tastes really good, and that increases appetite.
And this isn't just like theory or anecdotal stuff. There's an actual approved medication, dronabinol. Tell us about that, because that feels like a big step towards legitimacy.
It is a big step. Dronabinol, which is basically synthetic delta-9 THC, is indeed a registered medication in the USA. That fact alone underlines its established therapeutic value and the rigorous testing it went through. It got approval specifically for its antiemetic, that means anti-nausea properties, and also as an appetite stimulant.
And for which patients primarily?
Its main approved use in that context has been for patients dealing with the severe weight loss and muscle wasting that comes with age-related wasting disease, sometimes called cachexia. And the crucial point here, as you said, is this approval isn't based on just stories. It's grounded in solid evidence from multiple controlled clinical trials. That gives it strong scientific and regulatory backing.
So it's been properly tested in clinical trials. But how does it actually perform compared to other drugs used for the same thing, like stimulating appetite in those patients?
The sources mention a comparison with Magestrol.
Yeah, the comparison with magestrol acetate, that's a synthetic progesterone derivative, is quite revealing. Magestrol has also been used for a long time to boost appetite and help with weight gain in HIV/AIDS patients. The studies discussed in our sources showed some important differences. They found that low doses of dronabinol didn't seem to significantly boost magestrol's effects when they were used together.
Oh, so no additive benefit there.
Not significantly at low doses, apparently. And perhaps more importantly for its use alone, dronabinol by itself wasn't found to be as effective as magestrol specifically for promoting actual weight gain in those trials.
Ah, okay. So it has a role, but maybe not the top performer for weight gain specifically. Exactly. It helps frame dronabinol's specific niche. It definitely has a place as an anti-nausea drug and an appetite stimulant, but it's not necessarily better than all existing treatments for weight gain, nor does it always add extra benefit when combined with them. It's about understanding its specific strengths and limitations.
That's a really important point, finding the right tool for the job, understanding how it stacks up. And speaking of the right tool, it sounds like there are some real challenges with using cannabinoids therapeutically, especially dronabinol, dosing, administration. What makes it so tricky? Why might some patients just not be suited for it?
Yeah, there are several things that can make dronabinol difficult or unsuitable for some patients, which helps explain why its use hasn't become more widespread despite its approval.
Right.
A major one is its well-known psychoactive side effects.
Right, the high.
Exactly. But it's not always pleasant. Patients can experience things like dizziness, dysphoria, which is this general feeling of profound unease or unhappiness, depression, sometimes even hallucinations or paranoia. And these are obviously really unpleasant. They can be very disruptive to someone's quality of life and often lead patients to just stop taking the drug.
I can imagine. And what about figuring out the right dose?
That's another big challenge, especially because dronabinol is usually taken orally as a pill. It's the difficulty in dose titration.
Titration, finding that just right level.
Exactly. Finding that optimal balance where you get the most therapeutic benefit, like less nausea, more appetite, with the fewest side effects. Because oral dronabone have that delayed onset we talked about, maybe an hour or more to feel effects, it's really hard for patients to adjust their dose in real time.
Yeah, you wouldn't know if you took too much until way later.
Precisely. By the time the effects kick in, you might realize you've overshot, leading to strong side effects. Or maybe you undershot and didn't get enough relief. That delayed feedback makes finding the right dose incredibly tricky. Add to that the potential long-term effects that need to be considered, and you can see why it's not just a simple fix for every patient.
So, if oral dronabinol has these problems, slow onset, hard to titrate it, it makes total sense that patient advocates, maybe especially for AIDS patients dealing with sudden, awful symptoms, might look elsewhere. And our sources mention some advocates argue that smoked cannabis actually offers a better way to control the dose and symptoms. Why would they say that, given the smoking risks?
Their argument comes straight back to what we discussed about absorption, the rapid onset when cannabis is smoked. This lets patients feel the effects almost immediately, within minutes. That quick feedback gives them real-time control, allowing them to self-titrate much more effectively.
So they can take a little, see how it feels, take a little more if needed.
Exactly. They can take a small puff, wait a moment, assess their symptoms. Is the nausea going down? Is the pain easing up?
Mm-hmm.
And then decide if they need more or if they've hit the right spot. It's a sharp contrast to waiting an hour or more with an oral dose, wondering if it was the right amount. For someone in acute distress, that immediate control can feel incredibly valuable.
That makes perfect sense from the patient's viewpoint, wanting that immediate, fine-tuned control. But, as we keep saying, smoking carries those significant risks. Carcinogens, lung damage. Is there potentially a way to get that fast titration, that quick feedback, without the dangers of smoking?
Crucially, yes. And this is where the research and potential for medical applications gets interesting. Our sources point towards non-smoked forms that still offer rapid absorption. Specifically, they suggest that sublingual administration under the tongue
Okay.
or inhaled cannabinoids, but using non-smoked methods might allow for that better THC titration while avoiding the worst risks.
Non-smoked inhalation, like vaporizers.
Exactly, like vaporizers. These devices heat the cannabis just enough to release the cannabinoids as a vapor, but without actually burning the plant material and creating smoke. This vapor contains the active compounds, but has significantly fewer harmful byproducts like tar and those carcinogens found in smoke.
And sublingual. How does that work quickly?
Under the tongue, there are lots of blood vessels close to the surface. So compounds placed there can be absorbed directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system and that first-pass liver metabolism. Similar to inhalation in some ways. It leads to a faster onset than swallowing a pill.
Ah, I see. So the goal with these methods is to get the best of both worlds. Fast onset and control, but without the smoke damage.
That's the idea, precisely.
Yeah.
To achieve that rapid absorption and dose control that advocates value, but without exposing the lungs to the harmful stuff in cannabis smoke. It really points towards a potential shift in how medical cannabis could be delivered, focusing on maximizing the therapeutic effect by getting the compounds in quickly and controllably, while minimizing those serious long-term respiratory risks.
That's such a critical distinction, the compound versus how you take it. It's not just what, but how, and the huge impact that has on safety and effectiveness.
Absolutely.
Because no matter how beneficial these uses might be, any pertinent medicine comes with risks. So let's pivot now into section 3 and really try to balance the scales. Let's look at the risks and side effects, both acute and chronic, of therapeutic cannabinoid use. What are the immediate, acute adverse effects patients might experience? The kinds of things that might make them stop treatment right away?
Right, the immediate impact. As our sources detail, this often shows up as those acute psychoactive effects we touched on earlier. And they're common enough that they can and do lead patients to stop using the therapy, even if it's helping in other ways. These effects include things like dizziness, which can be really disorienting, dysphoria, that general state of unease or deep dissatisfaction we mentioned, feelings of depression, sometimes visual or auditory hallucinations, and paranoia, which would be incredibly distressing for a patient.
Yeah, none of that sounds pleasant.
No. They're clearly unpleasant and can seriously interfere with someone's well-being, their ability to function day to day, and just their willingness to keep taking the medication.
Those sound pretty disruptive. But what do the sources consider the single most serious acute adverse effect? And why is it so significant?
The sources single out impaired psychomotor function as the most serious adverse acute effect.
Psychomotor function? Coordination, reaction time?
Exactly. Coordination, reaction time, judgment. This is critically important because it has direct potentially dangerous practical consequences for safety. It means patients under the influence of cannabis or THC will likely experience reduced coordination, slower reflexes, and impaired decision-making.
So things like driving are a definite no-go.
Absolutely not. They should definitely not engage in any activity that requires alertness and precise motor control operating a vehicle, using heavy machinery, anything like that.
Yeah.
It's a clear public safety issue that needs to be stressed to any patient.
And what about mixing cannabinoids with other things, alcohol, other medications? Are there added risks there?
Yes, there's significant potential for what are called synergistic effects. That means the combined effect is bigger than just adding the individual effects together. This happens when cannabinoids are taken with other psychotropic agents, things that affect the mind. Alcohol is a big one,
Right.
but also other central nervous system depressants, or even stimulants sometimes. Combining cannabis with alcohol, for instance, can lead to much greater sedation, worse cognitive impairment, and a higher risk of accidents or falls.
So patients really need to be careful and tell their doctors everything they're taking.
Absolutely critical. Full disclosure to their healthcare provider is essential.
Okay, there's also some mention in the sources about immunosuppression weakening the immune system. That sounds like a big worry, especially for patients who might already be immunocompromised, like those AIDS patients we discussed. What do the sources say about that in the short term?
That's a valid concern, yeah. For short-term use, however, the sources indicate that the evidence for significant short-term immunosuppressive effects from cannabinoids isn't very strong or well established yet. The research hasn't shown a definitive, powerful link. And even if some minor effects do exist, the assessment in the source material is that they are probably not substantial enough to preclude short-term medical use.
So for short periods, it's likely not a major barrier based on current understanding.
That seems to be the consensus from the sources, yes. It's something researchers are still looking into, but it's not seen as a reason to automatically rule out short, medically supervised courses of treatment.
And do patients get used to these acute effects over time? Does tolerance develop?
Yes, that's another important factor with ongoing use. Patients often do develop tolerance to some of those acute psychoactive effects, like the dizziness or maybe the dysphoria.
And they might feel less intense after a while.
Exactly. The initial intensity of those unpleasant feelings might decrease as the body adapts over days or weeks of regular use. And this can actually be key for enabling patients to stick with a long-term treatment if it's otherwise helping them, because the most disruptive initial side effects might become less bothersome.
But does tolerance also develop to the good effects? Meaning they might need higher doses?
That's the potential downside, yes. Tolerance can also extend to the therapeutic effects, potentially meaning that higher doses are needed over time to get the same level of symptom relief. It's a common trade-off with many medications.
So taking a step back, when we look at all these acute side effects, how do they compare to the side effects of other common accepted medications? Did that big 1999 U.S. Institute of Medicine report offer any perspective on this?
It absolutely did, and it's a really crucial piece of context. That 1999 Institute of Medicine report, which was a major comprehensive review of the evidence back then, concluded that the acute adverse effects of cannabinoids are, and I quote, within the risks tolerated for many medications.
Okay, within the risks tolerated for many medications. That sounds pretty significant.
It's a profoundly important statement. It helps frame these side effects not as something uniquely dangerous or unacceptable, but as being comparable to the risk profiles we routinely accept for a whole range of other prescription drugs that doctors prescribe every day. It essentially helps normalize them within a medical framework, suggesting they are, in principle, manageable within a therapeutic context, assuming proper patient selection and monitoring.
Okay, that's helpful context for the immediate, short-term impacts. But what about the long haul? Chronic effects. The sources suggest these are potentially of greater concern, right? Especially if someone's using cannabis daily for years to manage a condition.
Absolutely. The chronic adverse effects are definitely framed as being of potentially greater concern for long-term medical use compared to the acute ones. It's a different situation entirely when you're talking about sustained daily or near daily exposure over months or years. The body's systems are under continuous influence, which could lead to cumulative impacts.
And the evidence for these long-term effects, where does it mostly come from? Is it from studies on supervised medical patients, or is it mainly from looking at recreational users? That seems like an important distinction.
It's an incredibly important distinction for how we interpret the findings. The evidence for these chronic adverse effects largely comes from studies of non-medical cannabis smokers.
Okay, so recreational users primarily.
Primarily, yes. These studies have mostly looked at the effects of chronic recreational smoking or the risk of developing dependence on cannabis or THC in the general population, not necessarily in a controlled medical setting with specific patient groups who have underlying health conditions.
So we need to be careful applying those findings directly to medical users.
We do. The motivations for use, the underlying health status, the patterns of use, they can all be very different between someone using recreationally and someone using therapeutically under guidance. So caution is needed when extrapolating.
This seems especially critical when we talk about really serious risks like cancer and lung damage. The sources make a very specific point here, don't they? About the delivery method versus the compound itself.
They do, and it's honestly one of the most vital takeaways for anyone listening because it gets so confused in public discussion all the time. The source material states directly, very clearly, that cannabis smoke is a probable risk factor for cancer and lung damage.
Okay, probable risk factor. That's strong language.
It is. It's a significant finding based on the composition of the smoke. And based on this, the conclusion drawn is stark. Smoking is an unsafe form of medication for any chronic medical condition.
Unsafe. Why? Because of the burning process.
Exactly. The combustion process itself, regardless of what plant material you're burning, creates numerous known carcinogens, respiratory irritants, and tar. These are harmful to the respiratory system. Just like tobacco smoke, cannabis smoke contains these dangerous byproducts.
So let me make sure I'm getting this absolutely right for everyone listening. The issue here isn't necessarily the cannabinoid compounds themselves in this specific context, but the act of smoking them.
Precisely. That is the crucial nuances sources are emphasizing.
Which means, if therapeutic cannabinoids are taken in other ways eating them, sublingual, vaporizing, that specific, very serious risk of cancer and lung damage from smoke can be completely avoided.
Correct. That smoking-related risk is entirely sidestepped if you use oral, sublingual, or vaporized inhalation methods for medical cannabinoid administration. These non-combustion methods deliver the cannabinoids without the harmful soup of combustion byproducts found in smoke. So they completely mitigate those specific risks of respiratory cancers and lung damage tied to burning and inhaling plant matter.
That's huge. It really reframes the safety discussion, separating the drug from the delivery method.
It highlights the vital importance of the delivery system in a medical context. It allows potential access to the benefits of the cannabinoids without taking on the severe risks of combustion.
Okay. Now, another major long-term concern often raised with cannabis is dependence. What do our sources say about the actual risk of developing THC dependence? And are some people more likely to develop it than others?
Yes, there is definitely a risk of developing THC dependence, and it's a legitimate factor to consider for long-term use. However, the sources specify that this risk isn't uniform across the population. It's highest in particular vulnerable groups.
Such as?
These include adolescents, particularly those who already have conduct disorders, persistent patterns of disruptive, aggressive behavior. The risk is also higher in people with pre-existing psychiatric conditions, like anxiety disorders or depression, or individuals who have a history of other substance abuse problems. But, the sources note, these high-risk groups are generally not considered the typical profile of someone seeking therapeutic cannabinoids for a chronic medical condition. Those patients are often older and focused on symptom relief.
So, for that typical patient, maybe someone with chronic pain or MS who's considering cannabinoids, how might they view this risk of dependence? Is it the same concern as for a teenager experimenting recreationally?
The sources suggest it's often a fundamentally different calculation for patients with chronic illness. For many of these people, who might be dealing with really debilitating symptoms, severe pain or nausea that isn't well controlled by standard meds, they might actually view potential cannabinoid dependence as an acceptable risk.
Acceptable? How so?
Their perspective is often rooted in a cost-benefit analysis. If the cannabinoid provides significant symptom relief, a tangible improvement in their daily quality of life, that benefit might heavily outweigh the concern about developing dependence.
So it's about function, reducing suffering more than anything else.
Exactly. It's about weighing the burdens. For them, it's often about managing their illness and reclaiming some normalcy, not seeking intoxication.
That's a really empathetic way to frame it, recognizing the patient's reality. And the sources even draw an interesting, maybe slightly provocative comparison to therapeutic opioid use here. Can you unpack that analogy? What does it suggest about dependence in a medical setting?
Yeah, the analogy to therapeutic opioid use is quite insightful, I think. It helps add nuance to how we understand dependence versus addiction or abuse. The sources suggest that older patients, the kind typically prescribed cannabinoids for chronic conditions, who might develop physical tolerance to THC's effects, they're considered less likely to engage in the kind of drug-seeking behavior seen in younger recreational cannabis smokers.
Okay, so less likely to show those addictive behaviors.
That's the implication. While physical tolerance or even dependence might develop, meaning the body adapts and might experience withdrawal if stopped, suddenly it doesn't necessarily automatically translate into the compulsive, often illicit behaviors we associate with addiction in a recreational context.
What's the key difference then? Motivation. Context.
It seems to be motivation and context, yes. For a chronically ill patient, the goal is usually symptom management, not getting high. Their use is ideally medically supervised, their lives might be more stable, and their focus is on therapeutic gain. This contrasts with, say, younger recreational users who might be using for escape, social reasons, or thrill-seeking, and might lack the same support structures or medical oversight, potentially leading to more problematic patterns.
So it offers a more, maybe, pragmatic view of dependence when it occurs in a legitimate medical context.
I think that's a good way to put it. A more empathetic and pragmatic perspective, distinguishing physical adaptation from problematic, life-disrupting addiction.
That's a really crucial distinction. How dependence is experienced and what it means can be vastly different depending on the context. Okay, so we've covered the products, the uses, the direct medical risks. But this whole area of therapeutic cannabis is also massively shaped by outside forces. Let's move into Section 4. The big roadblocks,
Yeah.
the commercial and legal hurdles that really stand in the way of wider use and integration into medicine. Starting with the commercial side, why do pharmaceutical companies apparently face substantial disincentives to develop and market new cannabinoids? You'd almost think there'd be a gold rush given all the interest.
You would think so, wouldn't you, given the buzz and the potential uses? But our sources lay out some pretty significant hurdles that make big pharma hesitant to jump in with the massive investment needed. First off, just the basic cost of R&D. Developing any new drug is incredibly expensive, and cannabinoids are no different.
Right. Clinical trials cost a fortune.
Exactly. Developing a new neuropharmaceutical, from finding the molecule through animal testing, then multiple phases of human trials, getting regulatory approval. It often costs hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars, and can easily take 10 years or more. That's a huge commitment of time and money.
And then there's the patent issue, isn't there? That sounds like a major sticking point, especially for the natural stuff from the plant.
Absolutely. This is critical for profitability and why companies invest. Our sources state very clearly that only synthetic cannabinoids can generally be patented effectively.
Only synthetic ones, not extracts from the plant.
Not in the same robust way, no. Natural derivatives, like extracts, which might be easier to produce or offer a wider range of potentially beneficial compounds, usually can't be patented like a novel, man-made molecule. And without strong patent protection, what's to stop competitors from just copying a natural product once a company has spent millions proving it works?
Ah, so they can't protect their investment.
Precisely. That lack of strong intellectual property protection drastically reduces the financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies to pour massive R&D funds into natural cannabinoids. They can't guarantee they'll own the market long enough to recoup their costs and turn a profit.
So even if a natural extract works great, the business case might just not be there for a big company. What about the size of the market itself? Is it really considered modest for the conditions cannabinoids might treat?
Yeah, the sources suggest that from a big pharma perspective, the projected markets for the specific symptoms cannabinoids are often studied for, like chemonausea or AIDS wasting, maybe some types of pain or spasticity, are viewed as relatively modest. And importantly, for many of these conditions, there are often already effective, well-established drugs on the market.
So they'd be competing with existing treatments.
Exactly. That significantly cuts into the potential profitability for a new cannabinoid drug. It would have to fight for market share against treatments doctors already know and trust. Why invest billions if the potential slice of the pie is small and already crowded?
And then layered on top of all that is the regulatory burden, especially in places like the U.S. How does that add to the disincentives?
Oh, the regulatory burden is huge. And it's even worse for substances that are still illegal at the federal level. In the USA, there are already strict regulatory requirements to get any drug approved. But these requirements become even more stringent, more complex, more time-consuming, and more expensive for compounds derived from or chemically similar to prohibited substances like marijuana.
So extra hoops to jump through just because of its legal status?
Loads of extra hoops.
Oh.
It has incredible complexity, mountains of paperwork, longer review times, and substantially higher costs to the whole development and approval process. It just creates a much higher barrier to entry and makes the whole venture significantly riskier and less appealing for pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, so it's like a perfect storm. Huge R&D costs, weak patent protection for natural forms, maybe smaller markets than expected, and then this amplified, complex regulatory pathway. No wonder there are such strong disincentives.
It paints a pretty clear picture of the commercial challenges, yeah.
So beyond the business side, what about the legal and regulatory obstacles? This feels like a particularly messy area, especially in the US.
It is profoundly messy. And the core issue, particularly in the United States, is this fundamental clash between federal law and state law.
Right. Schedule F federally, but legal medically in many states.
Exactly. Federal law, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, classifies marijuana as schedule law, meaning officially it has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This classification is in direct conflict with the growing number of state laws that allow medical cannabis use with a doctor's recommendation.
And what's the consequence of that conflict for people on the ground? Doctors, patients.
The consequence is severe legal jeopardy. It means that both physicians who recommend or certify patients for medical cannabis and the patients who use it remain potentially exposed to federal criminal prosecution, even if they are following their state's laws perfectly.
Wow. So they could be breaking federal law even while complying with state law.
That's the crux of the problem. It creates this enormous legal uncertainty and insecurity for everyone involved. A doctor could risk their license or worse. A patient could face federal charges.
That's an incredibly difficult position. So if state-level medical use is so legally risky federally, what about just allowing access through tightly controlled clinical trials? Is that a workable solution for getting it to patients who need it?
Well, using clinical trials does provide a very narrow, legally sanctioned pathway for some patients to access cannabis products, and importantly, it generates needed research data. But the sources point out this route only provides access to a few patients. It's very limited
Why so few?
because it effectively excludes the vast majority of patients who might benefit but either don't want to participate in a trial or perhaps don't qualify based on strict criteria. People might have privacy concerns or find the demands of trial participation too burdensome, like frequent visits, detailed tracking, or they might just prefer a more straightforward way to get medication recommended by their doctor. It's just not a solution for widespread access.
Okay. And even in countries where medical use is federally legal, like Canada, our sources mention that doctors there have still been quite reluctant to prescribe it. Why is that, if it's legal?
Yeah, even in Canada, where medical marijuana has been federally permitted in some form since the early 2000s, there's been noticeable reluctance among physicians to actually prescribe or authorize it. This reluctance seems to stem from a couple of main things: uncertainty and liability fears.
Uncertainty about what?
Uncertainty about the specific medical indications. There's been a perceived lack of really clear, consistent clinical guidelines and broad medical consensus on exactly when cannabis is the appropriate, effective, evidence-based choice. Doctors rely heavily on those kinds of guidelines.
And the liability fears.
Fears of being held legally responsible if a patient experiences harm, especially from chronic cannabis smoking. Given the known risks of smoking, we discussed the lung issues. Potential cancer risk doctors are understandably hesitant to sign off on a delivery method that could cause long-term health problems for their patients, even if the patient wants it for symptom relief. There's that core principle of do no harm.
Right, the Hippocratic Oath aspect. So even where it's legal, the medical establishment's caution creates another barrier for patients.
It definitely does.
And then there's just the practical problem. How do patients actually get a legal, consistent, quality-controlled supply? That seems like a huge logistical issue.
It remains a major practical hurdle, yes. Even where medical use is allowed, getting a reliable legal supply of cannabis that you know is safe and has consistent potency is often difficult and burdensome for patients. Unless the government directly supplies it, like Canada did initially with its MMAR program, or unless patients are allowed to grow their own, which has been proposed in places like Australia and is allowed in Canada now under certain rules, patients are often left in a lurch.
So where do they get it then?
It often means high costs if there are licensed producers, or it pushes people towards the illicit market, which completely undermines the whole point of regulated medical access and raises serious questions about product quality, safety, and consistency. It's a major supply chain problem.
And this whole situation, this sort of patchwork legality and access issues, often draws criticism from people who oppose cannabis legalization more broadly, doesn't it? The argument that medical use is just backdoor legalization.
Yes, exactly. Supporters of keeping cannabis prohibited have consistently argued that point. They often view granting these medical exemptions or creating medical programs as essentially a form of backdoor legalization. They argue it's not really about health, but more of a political strategy or a stepping stone towards full recreational legalization, kind of bypassing what they see as the proper public debate and regulatory process for such a big societal change. They worry it normalizes drug use and will lead to broader problems.
And tied into that criticism is often the fear of diversion, right? The idea that legal medical cannabis will just leak out and end up on the black market for recreational users. How do governments try to counter that fear? And importantly, what do our sources say about how big that diversion problem actually is?
Governments definitely face a challenge reassuring the public about diversion risks when they set up medical cannabis programs. There's this persistent worry, often amplified by prohibitionist arguments, that any legal supply, even for patients, will inevitably get siphoned off into the illegal market, fueling recreational use.
But is that fear proportionate to the reality?
Well, our sources offer a really important counterpoint, a quantitative perspective. They suggest that even if some diversion from medical programs happens, and it probably does to some extent, it is likely to be trivial by comparison with the illicit market for recreational cannabis users.
Trivial, meaning it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the overall black market.
That's the implication, yes, that the vast majority of illegal cannabis comes from much larger sources. Big illegal grow operations, organized crime networks, smuggling not primarily from individual patients diverting their limited medical supply. It really helps put the scale of that specific risk into a more realistic context, challenging a common, maybe overblown fear.
That's a really crucial distinction, that quantitative comparison, which often gets lost in the more heated emotional debate.
Wow. Okay, so we have really covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? Trying to dissect all the nuances of therapeutic cannabinoids. We certainly have. We started with just understanding the sheer range of potencies in different products, hash oil versus regular marijuana, and how the way you take it smoking versus eating drastically changes the effects.
Right. Then we moved into the documented therapeutic uses, focusing on things like stimulating appetite and reducing nausea, especially in conditions like AIDS wasting, and the role of synthetic THC, dronabinol, as an actual approved medicine.
hmm And we spent significant time on the risks, which is critical. We looked at the acute side effects like dizziness and impaired coordination.
And importantly, the chronic risks, really emphasizing that key finding. While the cannabinoids might have potential, the act of smoking cannabis is a probable risk factor for cancer and lung damage, making it unsafe for long-term medical use.
A vital distinction. But also noting that this specific risk is largely avoided by using non-smoked forms, edibles, sublinguals, vaporizers.
Yes, separating the delivery method from the drug itself. We also touched on dependence, how the risk might be viewed differently by patients versus recreational users, and the comparison to opioid therapy context.
And finally, we navigated through those really significant commercial and legal roadblocks that are still hindering wider acceptance and integration. Things like the high cost of R&D, the tricky patent situation for natural compounds.
The fundamental conflict between U.S. federal and state laws creating legal jeopardy, the limitations of clinical trials for access, doctor reluctance even where it's legal, and those persistent problems with ensuring a safe legal supply chain for patients, plus the surrounding political debates about diversion and backdoor legalization.
It's clearly a very complex and still very much evolving landscape. Lots of science still needed, lots of policy knots to untangle.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Given what we've discussed, the demonstrated therapeutic potential for certain conditions, alongside the very real risks, especially tied to specific ways of using it, how do you think research and policy should evolve to safely and effectively integrate cannabinoids into medicine, particularly thinking about those stubborn legal and commercial headwinds we talked about? And maybe, what responsibility does an informed public like you have in pushing for more focused research, especially research that looks closely at different administration methods, and for policies that actually reflect the scientific evidence rather than maybe outdated classifications or fears?
It's a big question.
Mm.
It really demands ongoing, rigorous science, much more transparent sharing of data,
Mhm.
and hopefully thoughtful, evidence-based policy reforms down the line.
Yeah.
The journey to fully understand and safely use these compounds therapeutically It's clearly far from finished. It's a conversation that absolutely needs to continue.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of therapeutic cannabinoids. We hope you feel a bit more informed and maybe even more curious. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.